Now that our definitions array is ready, let's overwrite our errors array. So errors equals, as you can see at the top of this file, we have errors as an empty array. So we are going to associate the function called validate with it, and we are going to pass two arguments. First one will be our collection, all the data that have been submitted through the form, and then we are going to pass the definitions. So this array we created in a previous video. What we are going to be doing here, this validate function will basically validate the submitted data against these definitions. And if there are any errors, it will return them as an array back to this errors array. And then we'll be able to use it on the form basically to display validation messages. So let's save the file, open our functions.php, and we start by declaring this new validate function. So function, then we have validate. And on new lines, I'm going to create, first of all, first argument will be of the array type. So we type hinted items, and the second one also will be array definitions. And then obviously an empty array for the time being, because we are going to check if this definitions array actually has any values. And if it doesn't, if it's an empty array, then we'll simply return an empty array back, because if it doesn't have any definitions, that means all of the fields in the form are optional. We don't even have to check them. Okay, so we start with the internal errors array. This isn't the same one as the one inside of the contact.php. That's not the same as this array. And what we are going to do is check if empty definitions, then simply return this empty array. So return errors, and that's it. And this function is now completed basically if the pass-through definitions array was to be empty. But if there are some values associated with this definitions array, and we do have quite a few of them here, as you can see, then we're going to proceed. And the first function we are going to be calling is validate empty. We are basically going to be checking for empty fields. So first item we're going to be passing through as an argument is items array. So items, which we got through as an argument as well. Second one will be definitions, and the last one will be errors array. Let's quickly create this function. So I copy the name of it and start function validate empty, and the first argument will be of the array type items again. Then we have again array definitions. This time we are not associating any empty array with it, because we know that there's definitely something, because obviously if it was an empty array, then we would already terminate this, finish this validate function at this line here, obviously, because it returns from within a function means once it's returned, nothing else is being executed from within this function. So we definitely have something there. So we're not going to be associating anything and any default empty array with it. And the last item is again of the array type, but this time we are going to pass it as a reference. So end symbol at the beginning and errors. And what we do next, inside of this validate empties, go through the for each statement, and we're going to be looping through the definitions array as key equals validation. And now, just so we can understand this a little bit clearer, definitions is this entire array. So basically all this. When we are for each looping through it, then the keys will be these first ones. So we've got department, we have name, we have email, telephone, and comment. And validation will be represented by this associated arrays with these keys. So basically, in the first case, the department will be the key, and validation will be this array with the required index and the value here on the right hand side, then index department, and again associated message on the right hand side. And then obviously the same for all the other ones. So now this validation is an array. We know this is an array. So what we're going to check is if, and I'm going to put on a new line, array key exists, and this time I'm checking for the required field, because I want to know if this specific field through which we are actually currently looping, this definition, contains the required, and all of them do. So if obviously if there was one without the required, let's say this department would only have department rather than required line, then this would be ignored, because this first statement inside of this if conditional statement here would return false. In other words, obviously this whatever is going to be in between the curly brackets wouldn't execute for this given one. Okay, but let's check for the array key exists inside of the validation. We know this is obviously an array because that's what the validation is associated with. And then we check in if the key required exists, and it does. So if it exists, but then also we want to make sure, so double and symbol, because we also want to check for another condition, and this condition will be within the brackets because there will be two different ones. Both of them have to return true, obviously, for this if statement to be true. So this one and whatever is returned from within these two brackets also need to return true in order for this if statement to actually be successful. So we are going to check exclamation mark, then either space, or you can type right next to it, array, again, key exists, and we're checking for key inside of the items. And what does it do is basically check this items array that we pass through, which is basically the post, the collected values. Inside of this get post, we only check for basically we only collected the values that were here. But if someone was trying to mess with the form and removed one of the important fields that we need for this form to actually be submitted, because they could do very easily, then what we would have would basically the system, this whole code would return error later on when we actually trying to process the email. So we need to make sure that whatever we require, this field actually exists inside of this post array. So we're checking if this post array, which is represented by items, the key that we actually currently looping through, which would be either this department, name, email, telephone, and comment, just because obviously it's going to be required already, because this first condition needs to be true in order for the second to check as well. So we know that it's got the required field, and if it's not inside of this array, this given key, for instance, department, that means it hasn't been submitted with the form. Someone has removed it from the form. Or we're going to check is empty, and is empty, that is the function we're going to create in just a moment. And we check for items and then the key. If any of this is true, then what we are going to do is simply add two errors, again another function we need to create, and we're going to pass the errors array to which we are going to add the message, then key, which it should be associated with, and then we need the given validation message. So from the definitions array, we're looking for our key through which we are currently looping, and then we're looking for the field required. So we want this message to be associated with this error. Okay, so let's quickly have a look at this isEmpty function first. So if we scroll down, and we are going to start with the function isEmpty, and we pass through the value as an argument. By default, we'll set it to null because it might be null. We're actually checking if it's null or not, if it's empty, in other words. So I'm going to return, and in between the brackets, I'm going to check empty value and is not exclamation mark is underscore numeric, because what happens when we actually check just with, and obviously value as an argument and then semicolon at the end, and again I'm creating this unnecessary spaces. What's happening basically when we check in with empty, if you pass zero, integer zero through, then empty will return true. And obviously that's not always the case. Sometimes you want zero as a value. You don't really want to check if you don't really need to want to get true if it's zero. You only want to get it true if there's nothing there, basically, if it's literally null. So you need to check if it's not numeric. So if it's zero, then in this case, this empty will return false, which means it's not empty. But if we only were to check with this empty function, that would return true, because zero for this empty statement is basically evaluating to true. So isEmpty function, and now let's quickly have a look at this validate empty again. So isEmpty, we're checking if array key does not exist. So if it doesn't, it hasn't been submitted through the form, this key, which is obviously key of the definitions array, or is empty. If this empty, and we check in actually straight away using the key on this array, because we know that if this one failed, then this second one wouldn't ever be executed. So we know that it definitely exists at this point inside of this items array. This key exists inside of this item array, because otherwise this one would fail and we wouldn't execute this is empty. So next one, add to errors. Let's quickly copy the name of this function. And after is empty function, add to errors, and we are going to pass 3 arguments through. So first one is of the array type, which is errors, and again we are going to be using this as a reference. So end symbol at the beginning, errors equals by default empty, because it may be empty obviously. Then we have a key that we want to add to the errors array, and then the message we want to associate with it. So message, and then set of curly brackets. In between the curly brackets, we are going to check if exclamation mark array key exists again, and we're checking for the key inside of the errors array, because what we want to do, if we already have a validation message for a given field, let's say for the department, then we don't need to add another one until this one has been fixed by it, because we only display one message on the form per field. So if we have 2 messages, then obviously that will be a little bit confusing. Let's only have one message. If there's one error, let's fix this error first before we display another message. Okay, so if it doesn't exist already, if it hasn't been already added to the errors array, then we're going to add it. So errors, and we add in this with the associated key, which is a field name. And then what we want to do, we want to associate the message with it. But rather than just typing message, which we could do, we want this message to actually be in red color to obviously highlight the problem a bit more. So what we're going to do, we're going to wrap it with the span tag with the validation message class, which I've already created obviously with the assets. You were able to download the CSS files. So what I'm going to do is, rather than putting this string here, this whole tag, I'm going to create a new function called wrap validation message, and I'm going to pass this message through as an argument. So let's quickly copy the name of this function, and after add to errors function wrap validation message, which we know takes only one argument, message. And we're not associating any default values with this argument because the message needs to have some content. Okay, so inside of this wrap validation message, what we're going to be doing is simply returning the HTML styling for our message. So in between a single quote, span class validation message, then closing double quote, closing angle bracket, then message in between, and then concatenating this with the closing span tag, obviously in between the single quotes again, and the semicolon. So now our wrap validation message will wrap the message we want to actually add to the form with this span with validation message class, which will make the text, actually the validation message, in red. If we now try and scroll up to the top, there we go. One thing I've just noticed here for validate empty, because obviously our errors array might be empty here, we should probably associate default empty array with it. So let's just add this equal symbol and then empty array to square brackets. Okay, inside of the validate function, because it's not completed yet, the next function we're going to be calling is called validate special. If there are any special cases, like for instance, we want to validate email or make sure that the department matches one of the items from predefined array and so on, this is where this function actually comes into play. So we are going to pass the same items. So items, then definitions, and errors as the last argument. And just to finish this function actually straight away, we are going to return errors from within this validate function to make sure that obviously when we calling it here, if everything is fine, we're only going to get empty array back to this errors, overwriting the default one which you've created here. Otherwise, we're going to get the list of items with the errors, basically, which we will later on be able to display it on the form. So our validate function is now finished. We just need to create this validate special one. So if we scroll down to the bottom of the file, and let's define this new one. So function validate special, and this one takes again 3 arguments. First one is of the array type. Actually, all of them, they are of the array type. Items. Second one will be array definitions. There we go. And again, we are not associating any default value with it because we know there is some value with associated with it already. Then array and symbol, because it's a reference again, errors, and by default it may still be empty. The previous validation function may not have found any problems. So let's quickly go through this one. So on that, within this function, we are going to start for each loop, and we're going to go through the items as key equals value. So basically, whatever we submitted through the form, the name of the field and what we've typed into the field. And then inside of this for each statement, we are going to check if array key exists, and then we go for the key, which is the name of the field, inside of the definitions. Then what we are going to do is validate case, and then key as the first argument, value as the second argument, definitions as the third, and errors array as the last one. So basically we are passing the name of the field, the key, then the value, whatever we've typed into the field of the form, then definitions array of the validation messages, and the errors array where we are actually collecting all the errors. Now let's create this validate case function. So after that one, function validate case, set of brackets, and we are passing again the same arguments. So key is the first one, then we have value, then we have definitions, which is of the array type. So let's type hinted, and then the last one also array. We are going to take it as a reference. So again, errors, and by default it might be empty. Okay, inside of this validate case, what we are going to do is, first of all, we are going to declare 2 cases because there are only 2 that we actually have with our form. Obviously, if you create any more forms, you need more special validations, then you will be able to add to this array. So we're going to create array cases equals, and what I'm going to do, it's going to be an array, and the first item will be email. So if I want to validate email, validate it against the function when we are passing the argument value, and this function needs to return true in order for this specific item to validate. And to validate our email field, we are going to use filter_var function. Let's quickly go to our browser, navigate to php.net, so php.net, and inside of the search, if we type filter_var, there we go, first item here, and what it does, it filters a variable with a specified filter. It takes 3 arguments. First one is mandatory, and then the other ones are optional. We're only going to be using 2 of them. The first one is the value to filter. Then we have the ID of the filter to apply, and there are types of filters. If we just click on this link, and we are interested in the validate filters, if we scroll down, you can see there's a long list. The one we are going to be using is called filter_validate email, but you can check for float, integer, IP address, regular expression, URL, and so on. So obviously you can have a read here if you would like to use any other filter as well. Let's quickly go back to our editor, and inside of this function, what I'm simply going to be doing is I'm going to return, and I'm going to use this function filter_var, and the value that I want to validate is the value that's going to be passed through as an argument, and I want to validate it as email, so we are going to use this filter constant validate email, and that's all we need to do to validate email address. Okay, so this function is now ready whenever we're going to be in need of validating email address. The next case will be for the department, so department, and then again we are going to create the function to validate the department value, and then value as an argument. And inside of this one, what we are going to do, first of all, we are going to get the collection of departments. So departments array, the variable, and it's going to be associated with the array, obviously, which will be returned from this get departments function, which you've created earlier. And then we are going to simply check if array key exists and return whether it's true or false. So return array key exists. Does it exist? True or false, basically. This array key exists returns Boolean true or false. So does value exists inside of this department array, and value, because if we just open this page's contact.php, we scroll down, you'll see the departments, we've been dealing with them as key equals department. And if I go back to the functions and look for this get department function, the key is the integer and the value is a string. And basically, when we submit the form, we are submitting the values. So as you can see, value here is represented by the key. So it's going to be one of these, either 1, 2, or 3. And then we check. If we go back, and I just scroll down to this last function we'll be working on, this validate case, it checks if this value submitted to the form exists as a key inside of this department array. So it will return either true or false. If it doesn't, then obviously someone's been messing with the form again and try to submit some invalid data. Okay, so these are the two cases. Obviously, if you have anything else that you would like to validate on the form, let's say one field needs to be just integer, then you can use again filter var with one of those filters as well. But we only have two fields that we need to validate, apart from the fact that they are that they have some value entered. So let's after this cases array, what we are going to do now is loop for using the for each loop again through those cases, and we are going to use the key will be represented by the case. So for instance, as case. So for instance, email or department. So this case variable will be associated with the either email or department, and then filter, which will basically represent one of these functions. So inside of this, for each statement, we are going to check again if, and again, this array key exists is like every single function that we do in here. So array key exists, and we're checking for the case. So it's not case, it's not the entire array, it's just the case, the given case, so either email or department exists inside of the definitions array, and we're looking for the given key through which we are actually validating. So for instance, if we validate for email, then we're definitely going to find this email. If we go back to our includes, if it's going to hit email, then we can find email case obviously here. So it definitions, and we need to provide the field. So obviously it's a key, and if it does exist and then also does not validate, so exclamation mark, we use the filter as the variable function, because it's this filter is represented by this function. So we append the brackets, and then we pass the value through as an argument, because we want to get the boolean true or false. This one, if the filter validates the value against the email filter, which means that it is a valid email address, then it's going to return true. Otherwise, it's going to be obviously false, in which case this condition will execute and return true, in which case we want to add two errors again, because it didn't validate. Obviously, the value was not an email address. Then we want to pass errors as the first argument, key. Then we need to obviously provide the message as well. So definitions, and again, for the given key and the case as well. In this case, obviously, it's going to be either email or department, because these are the only ones that are actually going to be triggered through this if statement here. Because obviously the cases only contain these two, so we only looking through two items at this point, obviously. And if it exists on the definition for a given key, if we can find definitions for email or department, and we will only find for the department, and for email we'll find email. So only these two will basically go through this cases loop here. And if they don't validate, then add obviously the message back to the errors array. And that's everything in this video. Let's now move to the next video when we actually applying this validation to the form.